Some of you already know. Others have wondered if it's just a misguided rumor. The truth is that I have taken the role of interim youth director. As a result, Brenda will be fulfilling most of the senior pastor duties, including taking the primary role of preaching. After much prayer and conversation with Becca, I encouraged her to take a 60-day leave to take care of personal concerns, and she's doing that. I informed the Staff Parish Relations Committee and the youth sponsors the day her leave began. I informed the youth 2 days afterwards when they met on Wednesday, the day before I left on vacation. Since it was something that came at my initiative, I didn't feel it was right to ask Brenda to make this announcement last week, even though I knew that might create an environment in which rumors might begin to fly. Today, I'm making it officially public knowledge. When the time comes for Becca to return, I will do what I can to help her make the transition back into the role of youth director until she's able to do that. And when that happens, then I will resume my duties as senior pastor. In the meantime, I ask for your prayers for Becca, for me, for our youth program. As you no doubt are aware, this is a very busy time for the youth, and I want to make sure everything goes well. So we need your prayers, and I want to make sure it goes well. I also suspect there are some who will see this as an opportunity to complain. It wouldn't be the first time people have complained about something a pastor has done, nor will it be the last. In fact, our text today is a fine example of a time when a decision was made and people complained about it. I invite you now to stand in honor of the living word, whose voice can be heard in the written word today, coming from the 17th chapter of Exodus. The whole Israelite community broke camp and set out from Sinai Desert to continue their journey as the Lord commanded. They set up their camp at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people argued with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why are you arguing with me? Why are you testing the Lord?" But the people were very thirsty for water there, and they complained to Moses, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us, our children, and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What should I do with this people? They are getting ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of Israel's elders with you. Take in your hand the shepherd's rod that you used to strike the Nile River and go. I'll be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Hit the rock. Water will come out of it, and the people will be able to drink." Moses did so, while Israel's elders watched. He called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites argued with and tested the Lord, asking, "Is the Lord really with us or not?" The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. You may be seated. You may not remember it, but this story is told again in the book of Numbers. I'm not exactly sure why it's told twice. I suppose the storytellers want to make sure we remember how the people tested God's authority. Or maybe it's to remind us that we all have tested God at one time or another. It is a curious note that in the book of Numbers, there are 10 different times when the people of Israel challenged the leadership of Moses, one for each of the 10 commandments. So maybe this story is told twice as a reminder that complaining is simply the beginning of temptation. The temptation to stray from God's designs, God's hopes, God's dreams for each of us and for all of us. Now, there is no question the concern for water is real. The people of Israel know they cannot live without water. We all know that. I know when I was in college, I often would take weekend backpacking trips up into the Cascade Mountains east of Seattle. Sometimes to the west, I'd go in the Olympics. At least one time I remember going up the south side of Mount Rainier. I remember one particular weekend I went up into the Cascades with my friend Mark. Now, I trusted Mark and his wisdom, especially in backpacking country, even though he's younger than I am. But that day, I questioned him. He heard me complain all the way up the mountain. We had chosen a trail that was much steeper than I like to travel anyway, and we were going up to a small water hole where we were going to spend the first night. But when we finally reached that point, there was no water. We went off the trail a ways looking for it. There was no water. Mark knew better than I that we needed to go to where there was water, and so reluctantly I followed him as we continued our hike. We nearly doubled our distance that we'd planned to cover that day. And my complaining continued. What made it worse was a last-minute decision on my part to take a different sleeping pad with me, one that was much heavier than what I was used to carrying. Not only that, but going this far took us off our planned direction and track. So in the morning when we woke up and reassessed where we were, we realized we couldn't go where we had planned to go. And so I continued to complain. We were safe. We had water, and yet I complained. It was several years later when I was serving as a Navy chaplain that I happened to be sitting in a meeting that was a safety briefing for Navy pilots. And in this discussion, the facilitator was asking what would happen in the unlikely event that your plane went down. What are the things you'd have to be concerned about? And people talked about finding berries, listening for the sound of a river so you know where water is. And that's when the presenter reminded us to keep our priorities straight. See, the truth is we can probably go several weeks without food. And we can go several days without water. But if there's smoke in the cockpit, you need to get out. He talked about keeping our priorities straight so that we don't miss the obvious. And I came away from that lecture with a tool that I have tried to remember that's not exact, but it's close enough. We can live 7 weeks without food. We can live 7 days without water. Yeah. We can live 7 hours without shelter of some sort. We can live 7 minutes without air. But we cannot live 7 seconds without God's grace. Because of grace, we always can find a reason to give thanks, even when we're looking for water. We can look for and find reasons to say thank you, even if we don't know where we will find our next meal. We can give thanks because we know whose we are. We have air to breathe. We have clothing on our backs, if not a roof over our head. We have many things for which we can give thanks to God. And yet most of us are prone to complain. In my complaining on the mountain that afternoon, that evening, and all the next day, I missed some of the spectacular views. I didn't notice all the wildflowers growing there. I probably overlooked some wildlife that we passed along the way. I missed out because of my complaining. Now, some of us go further than that. We begin to whine, that is, we complain about inconsequential things. John Wesley knew that the mark of a true Christian is someone who has a propensity to give thanks, to look for and remember the blessings that we have received, even in dire circumstances. there are things for which we can give thanks. When our daughter Tanya was little, she was having dinner at her grandparents' home. I wasn't there, but I've heard this story told many times. Apparently she was coached beforehand to always say nice things, but the dinner wasn't so good. As I've been told, the chili was way too spicy. So after dinner, after some thought, Tanya said, "Thank you, the water was good." There is always something for which we can give thanks. In the desert, where there is no water, it might be hard to find something nice to say. But complaining isn't going to help the situation either, especially since the water wasn't the real source of their concern. If you read this carefully, you realize that it's not about the water. It's just a ruse to complain about not being in Egypt. This is the quintessential appearance of that group I've encountered in every church I've served. We like to call it the Back to Egypt Committee. That's the group of people who always want to go back to the way it used to be. Back to the good old days. Back to when we had water whenever we wanted it. But the real problem isn't lack of water. This is simply a maneuver to deflect their real concerns. The real problem is lack of trust, a problem that is revealed in their inability to give thanks for what they already have. It's a lot like the ballad of Desert Pete. I don't know if any of you remember that song from the Kingston Trio. Do you know that one? I honestly didn't know that song either until I was trying to research the source of a story that I'd heard years ago. And I'm beginning to think that the story was based on the ballad, although it might be the other way around. The story is about a man who is in the desert and very thirsty, and he comes to a well with a note on it signed by Desert Pete. The note says the well works, the pump needs to be primed. Just what you need to hear in the middle of the desert when you're thirsty. A well that works that needs water in order to make it work, and you don't have any water. The note goes on to say, there's some water over behind a rock in a jar, but don't drink it. You'll need all of the water to prime the pump. You go to the water jar, and on the lid it's a reminder, do not drink this water. Use it to prime the pump. And then a note, please fill it when you're done. Now imagine the dilemma of this man in the desert who's thirsty, who finds water. What does he do? Does he drink the water he has, or trust this unknown person named Desert Pete? Now, it might be easy for us to say, well, trust the man. You pour it down the well, and water will come out and you'll be fine. But we're not in the desert, and we're not thirsty. Not only that, we live in a place where there's plenty of water to find. The man who's crossing the desert has a choice to make. He can complain because Desert Pete didn't leave enough water to drink and prime the pump. He can complain because he has to manually pump the pump to get the water out. Or he can give thanks that somebody had the foresight to save water to prime the pump. It's really the same dilemma the people in the wilderness face. They want to go back to Egypt where life was easy. They want to complain about what they don't have. Instead, God brings them to a place where they learn to depend upon God, where they learn to trust God, where they learn to give thanks to God. That's a lesson that still applies to us. It's the lesson of obedience. It's the lesson that isn't a once and for all lesson, though. We can't check it off our list and say we've learned to be obedient or to be thankful. Every day comes with a new opportunity to practice. That may be the real reason the storytellers tell the story of Massah and Meribah twice and refer to it again in the Psalms. If our first thought about something is to complain, this story is a reminder to consider instead something for which we can give thanks. turning our attention away from any deficiency we may find, we can look to see where there is plenty. In doing so, we remember that God is good all the time. Thanks be to God. Amen.